All right, so let's get going with everything. For those of you who don't already know me, again, I'm Dr. Amanda McCormick. I'm an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of the Fraser Valley. And I'm also a commitment leader for the Community of Practice in Domestic Violence Reduction under the Peace and Reconciliation Center at the University of the Fraser Valley. Our university is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Stalo peoples, known as the People of the River. We are grateful for the ability to live and to work in these territories. And so prior to beginning with our scheduled presentations for the day, I would like to start by introducing Stalo Grand Chief Clarence Penier, better known as Cat, who will welcome us to the event today. Grand Chief Penier is a residential school survivor. He has spent many years learning about Aboriginal rights and title issues at the local, provincial, national, and international levels. He has served on many different boards and organizations where he teaches about who his people are, and many of the people who he has worked with have become his good friends. He and his wife have been married for 50 years, a tremendous accomplishment, Cat. He has a son who has 4 daughters, and he has a daughter who has 2 cats. With that brief introduction, I would like to turn it now to Cat directly to continue with our welcome this morning. Cat, when you're ready.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the brief introduction. And just want to thank everybody for coming on to this session today. And it's a very important topic in terms of how we eventually look after our own people in our own communities. And I know that that's one of the topics that's important to all of our communities as well. So I just want to say thank you and welcome all. And it's going to be a lot of good information passed on to us. So thank you.
Thank you, Kat. We are grateful for your continued participation. We know you've been an amazing contributor to many of these events. And so I appreciate that you're here joining us today for the conversations. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Keith Carlson. Dr. Carlson is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Indigenous and Community Engaged History, and he is the Director of the Peace and Reconciliation Center at the University of the Fraser Valley. Dr. Carlson has worked with Stalo communities and mentored under Stalo elders since 1992. Individually or with his partners, Carlson has authored or edited 12 books and over 50 articles on Indigenous history, including the multi-award-winning book on Stalo history titled The Power of Place, The Problem of Time, Aboriginal Identity and Historical Consciousness in the Cauldron of Colonialism, authored in 2010. Dr. Carlson's scholarship has been translated into 3 languages, transformed into video documentaries and works of public art, and found expression in expert witness legal reports. Dr. Carlson was made an honorary member of the Stalo Nation in 2001, and in 2017, he was elected to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars. When not researching or teaching, when you have time, he can be found enjoying time with family and friends, wood carving, fishing, and strumming on his guitar. Over to you, Dr. Carlson.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Yeah, I think my familiarity with the chord patterns is getting pretty weak right now. I haven't picked up the guitar for a while. Thank you very much for everybody for coming here today. Thank you for inviting me to be here to welcome you to this on behalf of the Peace and Reconciliation Center. In the Halkomelem language, I'd say Lausiea, Lichakoea, Tusqui Keith Carlson. Hello, friends and respected people. Welcome here today. This is an important event for everybody. And in the Chinook jargon language, I would say Klahauya Tillicum, which is a language that was forged in the relationship between Indigenous people and settlers, a language that both sides contributed to. There are French and English words, there are Coast Salish words, there are Nuu-Chulnith words, and that both sides had to learn in order to communicate in the early years of this province. And I like to use that phrase at the beginning of meetings because it reminds me, and I think serves as a reminder, that there was a time when people were making serious efforts to communicate with one another and not assuming that one side would simply learn their language, learn their ways and adapt. And I see the work that Amanda's doing here today, and all of you. It really is in this this spirit, in this flavor, working with people who are the victims of domestic, intimate relationship conflicts, where they are looking and finding ways to enable those people who are, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. Right, that's who we're talking about here. to be able to communicate their story effectively to the police, to healthcare workers, to spouses and family members and supporters of various kinds, so that they're protected, so that they can develop agency and strength. And that is really what the Peace and Reconciliation Center is seeking to do. I'm coming to you today from the territory of the Chilhwayak tribe, one of the Stalo communities, where I'm running a field school, an ethnohistory field school, where we're hoping our students will make those kind of cross-cultural understandings and conversations. And that's what I really strongly encourage everybody to think about, is to embark on a process of long, sustained conversations and learning, where what you hear today is something that you discuss and you share, and then you go home and you ruminate on, and you perhaps talk to people in your circle that aren't here today to get some of their ideas and feedback, and then you bring that conversation and those insights and those ruminations back to this conversation, so that it continues and it enriches us all. And as someone who, there are people in my extended family who are victims of intimate partner violence and domestic abuse. I'm very keen to hear what I can do, what I can learn to help provide amplification to those women's voices, mostly women, some men, children, of course, and others. But the work you're doing is so important, and it is such a central part of it's so fundamental to what the Peace and Reconciliation Center is doing as we promote difficult conversations, as we promote research that is going to lead to an engagement and an understanding where it previously didn't exist. And so although I think like Kat, I'm not able to stay here all day with you today, unfortunately, due to I'm teaching and these commitments, and my hands go up to you, my hands go up to Amanda and all of her students and all of you who have taken time out of your busy lives to be here to share your knowledge and to learn knowledge from others. I think this is fantastic. And if I could say one other thing too, what really inspires me about these sorts of forums that I know is so central to Amanda's research program and portfolio is that we're actually bringing lived experience to these conversations. It's research, but it's informed by lived experience. And when we get down to it, the lived experience is about wisdom, what we used to refer to as wisdom. That is the knowledge that people have gained over time through experience and through talking to members of their community, often associated with elders and knowledge keepers. But each of us carries some of that wisdom. And we so often today live in a world where wisdom and life experience are not valued the way that other forms of knowing are valued. And so my hands go up to you today for bringing these voices together and for finding ways that we can help make this world a more peaceful and loving place. So thank you very much for inviting me here today, and welcome to everybody to the University of the Fraser Valley and the Peace and Reconciliation Center and this important work that you're all doing.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and I'm very grateful to Park for the platform that it's provided, not only to conduct this research, but also to educate others about the findings of the research. And so we're really grateful for everybody being here today and listening to the research and to the practice. And hopefully by the end of the day, you'll feel very educated and with a handful of strategies to take moving forward. And we encourage you to share what you've learned today with others. Once we share out those links, feel free to forward those on. Thank you so much for the welcomes, everybody. I appreciate that. Yeah, and we'll get going now with the first talk. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, so everybody's okay with seeing the screen in the background there? I should be pretty skilled at this now, being an academic who's been teaching online for several years. All right, so we're going to get going with the first talk. I'll be delivering this on behalf of myself and my undergraduate research assistants, who unfortunately for me are growing up and fleeing the so-called academic nest, but I'm grateful that they are here today in support and will be able to answer any questions about the research that you might have. And also, as I mentioned, they'll be monitoring the chat box. So please connect if you have any issues there. All right, so I'm going to talk to you today about a little bit of the background literature, what we know about supporting survivors and what we don't know about supporting survivors with intimate partner violence related head injuries. But first, I want to take you back for a couple of decades. And so, yes, I'm going to date myself a little bit here to the time when I was a teenage rugby player, playing in a typical high school rugby game. This is obviously not me, back in the mid 1990s. So as some of you may know, in the game of rugby, there's a lot of pushing, a lot of shoving, tackling as people try to get control of the ball. And so in one of the games I was playing, I was pushed by someone and I went to step backwards, and there was a person lying on the ground directly behind me. And so I had nowhere to put my feet. So I ended up sort of flipping over backwards over the person, striking the back of my head onto the ground. The grass, so somewhat soft, but still a little bit jarring in the head. While shaken and dazed, we were already down players, key players on our team. And so my coach, again, mid-90s, said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yep, I feel okay." And he said, "Okay, get back in there, keep on playing." And so I did. 10, maybe 15 minutes later, I was tackling another player. A third player came in from the side and kneed me right in the temple here. And that was it for me. At that point, I was down, unable to get back up again. Every attempt to move my body resulted in waves of nausea and dizziness. I don't think I lost consciousness, but I certainly wasn't altogether there as they brought the ambulance down onto the field and carted me away to the hospital with my panicked mother in tow. So at the hospital, they of course checked me out and told me, on the basis of my recollection, I don't recall any scans being done. It was simply a number of questions that they asked. But they told me that I'd sustained 2 concussions during the game that day. So 2 concussions back to back. The remedy, go home and rest, but don't fall asleep. They told my mom, don't let her sleep. If she falls asleep, it could be very dangerous. She might not wake up. You have to keep her awake for at least tonight. And after that, you can let her rest. So the result of that is that I went home and I watched hours upon hours of sports on television. I remember that it was March and it was the college basketball playoffs, also known as March Madness, which, as you can see, is obviously quite a loud, quite a visual, quite a stimulating event. So in other words, I continued to stimulate my brain for hours following my double concussion, letting it have little rest. I was just thrilled to be able to watch basketball all weekend on TV. Nowadays, we know that this is terrible advice. My son, a couple of years ago, had a concussion when he fell at an indoor playground while running with socks on a hardwood floor. He smashed his forehead onto the floor and, of course, had a whole host of number of issues with that. I took him to the hospital to be assessed, and it turned out that he had sustained a concussion from smashing his head onto the floor. And the advice then was given to, again, let him rest as much as possible, but to have no TV or other forms of visual stimulation for at least a week or 2 to let the brain recover. So we have come a very long way in understanding how to treat head and brain injuries like these. We've also come a very far way in learning how to prevent them. After all, we now have concussion protocols for sports. We've removed the physical aspect of some sports, especially from child or youth leagues. But head injuries like the 2 stories that I've just shared with you are not that uncommon. And so let me just ask you for a minute, how many of you attending today have either sustained a head injury, such as a concussion, or know of someone who has, somebody who's close to you? I do have a poll ready to go. Let's see if I can launch it. Let's see, polls. There we go. Okay, so just take a minute and fill it out. Have you or someone close to you ever experienced a head or a brain injury? And the options, you'll be able to see in a moment there, are either yes, I think so, but I've never had it assessed medically, or no. So we'll just take a minute to let everybody fill that out. All right, I think everybody's had a chance to fill it in there. The numbers are moving around a little bit, but as we can see, most people, so 3/4 of people that are here today have sustained a head injury. And another 15 or so % believe that they've sustained a head injury, but have never had it assessed medically. So we're amongst the minority if we've never experienced a head injury or a brain injury. So head injuries and the traumatic brain injuries that we'll be talking about today are in fact very common. In fact, Brain Injury Canada estimates that approximately 1 person every 3 minutes in Canada experiences a traumatic brain injury. So that's about 20 people who might experience a traumatic brain injury just during my 1-hour talk today. Now, again, for most of us, that's going to be sports related, or it's going to be the result of something like a car accident. And for most of us, that's hopefully going to be a rare occurrence. Unfortunately, however, one of the other major causes of traumatic brain injury is intimate partner violence. And often in this case, it is not a rare occurrence. Instead, we're talking about a population, primarily of women, who are subjected to repeated acts of violence, sometimes over the period of several years. The most recent general social survey data on self-reported victimization in Canada from 2019 found that around 3.5% of Canadians experienced spousal violence over the 5-year period between 2014 to 2018. This average was based on 4.2% of women reporting victimization as compared to 2.7% of men. We also know, as you can see here, that the rates of both the past 5-year as well as lifetime victimization by intimate partner violence amongst Indigenous peoples tends to be at least 2 to 3 times higher, especially when we're talking about Indigenous women. And Indigenous women tend to experience more severe forms of violence by their partners, including higher rates of strangulation and physical assault. So generally speaking, most of those reporting victimization experienced multiple incidents of violence in their relationships. As reported by Conroy in 2021, 28% of people experienced between 3 and 10 incidents of violence in the past 5 years, while an additional 17% experienced more than 10 incidents of violence in the past 5 years. So that's 45%, nearly half of those experiencing intimate partner violence experienced it at least 3 or more times in the past 5 years. We know that those who experienced more than 10 incidents of violence were disproportionately more likely to have experienced the most severe forms of violence, with 40% of this group reporting that they had been beaten physically, strangled, threatened or assaulted with a weapon, or sexually assaulted. Overall, more than 1/3, so 39% of women reporting victimization had been physically injured, and about half of them, 47% of those who had been injured, had needed to actually take some time away from their daily activities as a consequence of that injury. Now, unfortunately, while the General Social Survey data examines and reports on the general nature of the injuries that have been sustained, they do not separate out head injuries as a specific outcome of the violence, nor do they examine on the body where the injury or injuries occurred. So while we know that about 11% of those who had experienced physical injuries were hospitalized as a consequence, and that about 16% experienced an internal injury, we don't actually have good data in Canada on how many experienced some form of head trauma. The data is also limited in that, unfortunately, many survivors of intimate partner violence who have experienced a head injury as a result of that violence actually don't know that they have sustained a head injury, as this does not always result in an obvious injury, and the symptoms may actually be written off as a consequence of something else. As this is a self-report victimization survey, then, experiences of head injuries would likely be significantly underreported in this population, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that in just a moment. First, though, it's important to explain what we mean when we talk about head injuries. This term may be broadly used. So for example, a cut on the forehead is considered a head injury. Bruising or abrasions or having your hair pulled or ripped from the scalp would all be considered a head injury. But what we are increasingly commonly coming to understand is that when it comes to intimate partner violence, the damage also often goes beyond the scalp level to affect the functioning of the brain itself, potentially causing both short and long-term effects, reducing life quality and increasing risk for future repeated victimization. A traumatic brain injury, or a TBI, can occur when a person receives a sudden blow to the head. Being hit in the head with a fist, having your head slammed into a wall, being shaken violently, being pushed down the stairs, all of these can result in neurological damage as the brain is shaken back and forth or side to side within the skull. So think back to the rugby clip that I showed you a few minutes ago, and you can see in that video how the head snapped back when the person was tackled. So at one point, your skull, your head are heading in one direction and your brain is going in the same direction. And then all of a sudden, force is applied, your head starts traveling in a different direction and your brain keeps going forward. This can result in bruising, swelling, and bleeding in the brain. But traumatic brain injuries do not only occur as a direct result of force being applied to the head. In fact, something that we are becoming increasingly aware of among survivors of intimate partner violence is just how common non-fatal strangulation is, with estimates ranging from 1/4 of the survivors of intimate partner violence having experienced at least one form or one prior incident of non-fatal strangulation to more than 3/4 of survivors reporting this experience. Unfortunately, the research shows that experiencing multiple non-fatal strangulation incidents over repeated incidents of intimate partner violence is not at all uncommon for female survivors of intimate partner violence. So just so it's clear everybody's on the same page, strangulation occurs when somebody's airway is constricted by something or someone. The most common example might be when somebody squeezes your neck with their hands, cutting off your airflow, preventing oxygen from reaching the brain. Other examples might include having your neck compressed by something like somebody's forearm or their knee, so if you're pressed against the wall or pressed against the floor, or you might have your airway compressed by something like a belt or a rope that is tightened around your neck. But regardless of how the strangulation is accomplished, the outcome is that either little to no oxygen reaches the brain for a period of time. And this can potentially cause either an anoxic or a hypoxic brain injury, where the brain cells begin to die off from either a complete lack of oxygen or a partial lack of oxygen. And it takes just minutes for this to begin. A non-fatal strangulation can also become a fatal strangulation even weeks to months following the initial strangulation event, as the pressure that was placed on the neck may have resulted in something like a carotid dissection, where the carotid artery is ruptured from the pressure that's been placed against it. This then increases the risk of stroke over the following days and months, when blood clots that form at the site of the injury can break off and travel upwards to the brain. As research suggests that less than 1/3 of women who have been subjected to a non-fatal strangulation seek medical care, their injuries are potentially going undetected and untreated, increasing the risk for these severe or lethal outcomes to develop. So therefore, TBI can result not only from the physical force or pressure, it can also result from pressure being applied to the head or the neck region of a person. The physical force or the deprivation of air can result in the death of brain cells and neural damage and neurochemical reactions that contribute to alterations in the brain functioning that can last over the short or the long term. TBIs can be classified as either mild, moderate, or severe. This is often done by something called the Glasgow Coma Scale, which you can see a copy of here. This is a very simplified version. I've got another version I can show you later that's a little bit more complicated. So you can see here that it measures the extent of the potential damage of the head injury using 3 main forms of behavior. So there's eye response, verbal response, and motor response to different forms of stimulation. So for example, walking my son hypothetically through this list, his eyes remained open as they normally would. They weren't closed and only opening when I spoke to him or pinched him. I didn't pinch him, I should just point that out. Whereas someone who had lost consciousness would score a 1 here. Somebody with an altered conscious state who's conscious but not really there, not really aware, might score a 2. Whereas in the case of my son, thankfully, he would have scored a 4. In the next section here, you can see the verbal response. Again, somebody who's not conscious would score a 1, or if they were conscious but unable to speak intelligible words, so they were sort of just groaning, for example, they would receive a 2. Again, in my son's case, he would likely receive a 4. He was speaking normally with the appropriate words and phrases, but he was confused about what was going on. He was having short-term memory loss. And so he wasn't sure what was happening or why it was happening. And finally, there's also the motor response down here, such as if the person who has sustained the head injury responds when pain or pressure is applied. In my son's case, he was able to follow the doctor's commands, for example, to straighten out his leg. And so he would have scored, again, upwards of around a 5 or a 6 in that case. So in total, he would have received about a score of 15, which, as you can see here, is the best response case. However, this would still be considered a mild traumatic brain injury, and that is in fact what he was diagnosed with. In fact, even somebody who's lost consciousness for a few minutes might still only meet the criteria for a mild traumatic brain injury. And so it's probably not going to be surprising to you to hear that most people who experience a TBI end up being diagnosed with a mild one. This also does include most survivors of intimate partner violence. Most of their injuries will end up being classified at the mild level. However, this does not mean that the effects are only going to last for a few hours and then you recover from them. Many people who experience a mild traumatic brain injury take much longer to recover from it, with symptoms potentially lasting for weeks, if not months or even longer, particularly if the traumatic brain injury goes untreated. Further, while most survivors of TBI might meet the criteria for a mild rather than a moderate or a severe TBI, research also suggests that repeated injuries to the head increase the risk for more severe outcomes to occur, as well as increase the period of recovery. We also know through research that survivors of intimate partner violence typically experience multiple incidents of violence before reporting it, and that the head and the face area are some of the areas that are most commonly struck during a violent attack. However, we surprisingly have limited data, or at least Canadian data, on just how common head injuries like these are among survivors of intimate partner violence. Helena, or Lynn Hag, is a social work PhD candidate at Wilfrid Laurier University, where for the past several years, she's been studying brain injuries amongst female survivors of intimate partner violence. She's also developed a toolkit that I will link for you over the lunch break. She has published several different studies with Canadian data, and so is one of the Canadian leading scholars on this issue. As you can see in this image, although you can't quite read it, several years ago, she and her colleagues completed something called a scoping review, which is like a structured approach to reviewing the literature, the research literature that's been published on a particular topic. So in this case, she and her colleagues reviewed the findings of 42 published articles that had directly studied traumatic brain injury as a consequence of intimate partner violence. While these 42 studies were primarily not Canadian, most of them were American, we can use them to draw some conclusions about the frequency of traumatic brain injury amongst survivors of intimate partner violence. And so briefly, here are 3 of the main conclusions that they drew. First of all, the estimates of the prevalence of traumatic brain injuries amongst survivors of intimate partner violence ranged quite broadly from about 19%, so about 1 in 5, all the way up to about 3/4 or 75% of the sample. Now, one reason for this broad range, this broad estimate, happened to be the type of sample that the study was based on. If you go to draw a sample from a higher risk population, such as people accessing the emergency department or women who are accessing shelters or transition homes, those samples tend to show the higher rates of traumatic brain injuries amongst the sample populations. But another reason for the broad range was the nature of how traumatic brain injury was assessed for the study. As some of the studies used more of the formal screening protocols or a formal diagnosis, while others insinuated probable TBI on the basis of a history of being struck in the head, struck in the face, or having lost consciousness. And so the more strict the assessment criteria, the lower will be the estimated prevalence of TBI. This is a common challenge for researchers, and people use different tools to measure the same concept. It makes it difficult for us to compare those findings against each other. But this is actually good news for practitioners, because a second major finding from their review was that there were several different tools that are commonly used to screen for head injuries. We've already briefly reviewed the Glasgow Coma Scale, but one of the other common screening tools for TBI is called the HELPS tool, which is a very quick and popular screening tool that's easy to use as it doesn't require a medical degree to implement. It simply uses several questions to assess whether somebody has had a history of being struck in the head. Generally, in addition to the formal assessment protocols, Haag et al. Identified that several tools were available for frontline criminal justice or community professionals that are working with survivors of IPV, some of which will be discussed in the subsequent presentations to follow mine. But that does lead me to the third main conclusion from their study, which was that frontline professionals who are working with survivors of intimate partner violence were strongly recommended in many of these studies that they implement routine screening for traumatic brain injury when intimate partner violence has been disclosed or suspected, given that early screening and intervention can lead to improved outcomes. So it's critical that we talk about these issues and that we begin to put into practice some of these screening tools so we can better assess, sorry, that's my dog in the background. We can better assess and understand when somebody is in need of some supports to cope with the traumatic brain injury that they have sustained. Again, many of these studies were American, and we have very limited data in Canada, both about how common non-fatal strangulation is, as well as how common traumatic brain injuries are amongst survivors of intimate partner violence. In many cases, the studies like these ones that were reviewed by Haag et al., they go specifically to these high-risk populations where they're likely to find a higher prevalence rate of survivors who have experienced the more serious or severe forms of victimization. But for a number of very good reasons, many survivors of IPV will not use services like the emergency rooms or go to the shelters or transition homes, or will not report their victimization to the police. And so these studies overall don't give us a really good understanding of just how common traumatic brain injuries are amongst the larger population of survivors of intimate partner violence. In fact, there are massive gaps when it comes to understanding the experiences of head trauma amongst the broad community of survivors of intimate partner violence in Canada. And I'll just review a few of the main reasons for this. The first major reason for this gap is that only about 1 out of every 5 victimizations of intimate partner violence are reported to the police in Canada. And so there's a very large dark figure or unknown amount of unreported physical victimization by an intimate partner, and an even larger dark figure of unreported sexual victimization, which of course can also result in a head trauma when non-fatal strangulation is involved. As we'll also see in a moment, very few women access healthcare following intimate partner victimization. So if they're not going to the police and they're not going to the shelter or victim services or the hospital, then it's not likely that they're receiving the services that they need in order to cope with the head injury, which may ultimately lengthen the amount of time that they experience the symptoms and increase the difficulty of successfully intervening going forward. Further, even if the victimization is reported to the police or is reported to another formal service, such as one of the ones shown here, another gap may occur where the TBI, the potential traumatic brain injury, goes undetected and undocumented. Traumatic brain injuries may not always be overtly obvious in the moments following the impact. In fact, some of the symptoms of a TBI may not appear for several days or even several weeks following the event. Some research suggests that survivors of intimate partner violence may experience what's known as a subconcussive head injury, where the more overt signs of a concussion, such as headaches, vomiting, or dizziness, are not experienced at all by the survivor. Other symptoms, like difficulty following instructions, difficulty multitasking, or difficulty paying attention, may not be connected by the survivor of the head injury to the head injury that they sustained. They might be attributed to some other cause, such as the trouble that they're having with sleep, for example. And as we'll review in a moment, there are many possible symptoms of a head injury, and many of these are not well known, or again, may be misattributed to another source, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or depression. Similarly, research conducted by Gail Strack and colleagues with the US-based Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention concluded that out of 300 strangulation files that were submitted in San Diego City for a misdemeanor prosecution, 67% of these files had no symptoms that were either documented by the police or reported by the victim. 67%, so that's 2/3 of cases referred for prosecution had no symptoms documented. And a full 50% of the files had no visible injuries present that would be indicative that a strangulation had occurred. When there were visible injuries present, these were most often minor scratches or redness. The more severe injuries, in some cases, were not apparent until a couple of days following the strangulation. Alarmingly, they also found that only 5% of the women sought medical attention within 48 hours of being strangled. Granted, this is the US, and it's obviously a very different healthcare system to ours, but in fact, this is the third major gap in having good statistics on the prevalence not only of non-fatal strangulation, but also of traumatic brain injuries amongst survivors of intimate partner violence. So while the subsequent rates are not as shocking as the 5% reported by Strack et al. Back in 2001, research studies since then have continued to conclude that at least half to 3/4 of female survivors of intimate partner violence refuse or decline medical attention. Even if they've lost consciousness during the event, they still refuse to go and receive the medical care. Police responding to a 911 family violence call may call for EHS to attend to the scene, but it's not uncommon for the survivor of the intimate partner violence victimization to refuse to go to the hospital for further care. We are lucky in Abbotsford that we have some excellent forensic nurses, and you'll be hearing from them later this afternoon. But even as busy as they are, they're still only in contact with a minority of those who have experienced intimate partner violence. And these trends have only gotten worse during COVID-19. During COVID, we all know, wait times in hospital settings increased exponentially. Policies were implemented to prevent hospital attendees from bringing others along with them for support. But in many cases, this also meant that the survivors of intimate partner violence couldn't bring their dependent children with them to the hospital, and also couldn't find alternatives to care for them. So instead, the choice was simply not to go. We also know that there was issues with transportation within cities, and especially between cities during COVID. It became much more complicated to go from one jurisdiction to another. And of course, people feared leaving their homes. And in particular, they feared going to healthcare settings where the perceived risk of catching the virus was high. And not only perceived, it was a real risk of potentially catching the virus. And so there were, during COVID, as well as prior to COVID, a lot of deterrents to accessing healthcare. In a study examining the impact of COVID-19 on intimate partner violence service provision in Canada, Haag and colleagues in 2022 interviewed 18 intimate partner violence service providers and concluded that the pandemic led to reduced capacity and longer wait times for services, something that I'm sure surprises literally nobody in this room, this theoretical room. This also impacted their ability to form trusting relationships with their clients, which is important to encourage disclosure, not only of the intimate partner victimization, but also the experiences of a head injury, as some survivors of head injuries are fearful of disclosing this for fear that it may raise issues around parenting capacity, for example. It also prevented survivor or service providers from being able to provide the necessary supports for their clients, such as attending the healthcare settings with them, where they could help them to explain their symptoms to the healthcare provider. So as a result of the various gaps in reporting intimate partner violence and inquiring about potential head, face, or neck trauma, the available research suggests that few women will end up receiving medical attention following violent victimization by an intimate partner. And as noted, this is especially problematic because there can be both short and long-term effects of head trauma that could be treated or at least somewhat mitigated through proper medical care and support and early intervention. So let's now examine some of the possible symptoms that somebody with a TBI might exhibit. Many of the more commonly recognized symptoms of a TBI will be somatic, so essentially being experienced within the body itself. For example, somebody having a headache, somebody feeling nauseous or actually vomiting, feeling dizzy, having blurred vision, struggles with balance or coordination, having a ringing noise or tinnitus in their ears, being sensitive to light or sound, having numbness or tingling in their extremities might all be symptomatic of a traumatic brain injury. There are also many cognitive symptoms of traumatic brain injury. For example, the most terrifying part for me when my son sustained a mild traumatic brain injury was the memory loss. Immediately after he sustained the blow to his forehead, over the next several hours, he continued to ask me over and over again, what is going on? Why are we at the hospital? Where's my brother, who I dropped off with his father so I could take my son to the hospital? He simply, he knew who he was. He remembered his name. He knew how old he was. He knew where we lived. So all the long-term memories were intact, but he could not remember anything from within a few hours of him striking his head on the floor. Thankfully, that symptom was gone by the next day. By the next day, he was able to remember numbers for a short period of time, but he still had no memory of the event itself. He's never remembered exactly what happened that day. But for the most part, his short-term memory loss did resolve, thankfully. However, for others, this may be more of a long-term effect that, again, is sustained for weeks or months following the event. Other cognitive issues that they may continue to struggle with are, as I mentioned earlier, paying attention or engaging in planning and following through on tasks, following through on plans, problem solving, or multitasking. They may have difficulty following through with instructions or directions that are given to them, especially if they're longer or complicated. They may have impaired reasoning or judgment, might both be impaired, and there may be impaired response inhibition. So in other words, the person with the traumatic brain injury may have now an increased tendency to act more impulsively than in the past. They may also experience sleep issues. So for example, sleeping too much or having trouble or the inability to fall asleep or stay asleep. And commonly, they experience symptoms related to mood. A person with a traumatic brain injury may experience increased anxiety, depression, irritability, difficulty expressing their emotions, and even in some cases, personality changes. They may also exhibit anger and frustration more easily and experience impaired stress response. So this is just a partial list of the potential symptoms that might appear once somebody has sustained a traumatic brain injury. The list of possible indicators is quite lengthy. While some of the symptoms may resolve on their own without treatment, they may also become the new way of life for some survivors of intimate partner violence, particularly if they go undetected and untreated. And if particularly so, if the person continues to be exposed to head trauma through repeated incidents of violence, which again is quite common among survivors of intimate partner violence. These symptoms can obviously lead to challenges with their everyday activities. It can lead to a lower quality of life. And it may, of course, pose particular challenges for you when it comes to engaging with services in relation to their victimization, leading to attrition from services or poor service outcomes. Unfortunately, the research also suggests that many of these indicators of a head injury either go unrecognized by service providers or may be misinterpreted as a symptom, again, of something else. So for example, sometimes the results of a brain injury may manifest themselves in slurred speech or balance issues, and the person may be wrongly interpreted as being under the influence of drugs or alcohol. In other scenarios, they may be struggling to remember to show up for appointments on time, or they may fail to follow through with directions or tasks that have been given to them by you. They may change their story about what happened during that episode of violence, or they may even act aggressively towards others around them, whether it's fellow clients or the service providers themselves. All of these behaviors may be viewed as an unwillingness to engage in services, when in reality, what they reflect is a person who is struggling to cope with the daily issues posed by the traumatic brain injury that they've sustained. Complicating the matter further is that many of the symptoms that I just reviewed with you are not only indicative of a TBI, but may also occur as the results of trauma. Someone who's experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very common following intimate partner violence, may likewise struggle with issues with their memory. They may likewise have trouble with cognitive skills like multitasking and problem solving. And they may experience issues, mood-related issues like depression or anxiety and problems with sleep. And they may use substances to cope with all of these symptoms. So symptoms themselves should not be used on their own to assess whether someone has experienced a head trauma, but they certainly should point to the need to ask a few clarifying questions about potential exposure to head trauma, as this may determine the need for future assessment and needed medical care. Excuse me. So as I noted a bit earlier, several studies have now recommended that service providers who work with families experiencing intimate partner violence receive education and screening on how to screen for potential head injuries. As will be discussed in the subsequent talks that follow mine today, a number of tools to support this have been developed. For the remainder of my talk, though, I would like to take you through the results of some of the data that we have collected from a sample of service providers who are working with survivors of intimate partner violence in the Fraser Valley. So as I briefly noted earlier, one of the positions that I hold is as the commitment leader for Parks Communities of Practice. And as mentioned, my community of practice is under the broad field of reducing domestic violence. Much of my work over this past year has involved a small group of well-versed practitioners and academics who I pulled together to address specifically the topics relating to brain injuries in the context of intimate partner violence. And it's through the various discussions over the past year with this group that the project that I will talk about today began. So one of the members of our committee, Steph Ashton, a retired RCMP member who is now completing her PhD, studying how to improve the detection and response to head injuries and strangulation and intimate partner violence files that are reported to the police, she brought an interesting case study forward for our group to discuss. You might have heard of this case because it was recently in the news. It was the first such case of its kind, where a female survivor of intimate partner violence civilly sued her former spouse for damages associated with the traumatic brain injury that she sustained as a consequence of his abuse towards her. This case received a very different outcome when it initially proceeded through the criminal justice system, as compared to how it was received in the subsequent civil suit. The case involved historical sexual assaults, as well as an assault that resulted in the police attending the scene, during which it was discovered that her husband had struck her several times in the head. This was found by the medical experts who testified to contribute to ongoing symptoms of a mild traumatic brain injury that lasted for several years following the violent incident. And it contributed to an inability of her to be able to work. Now, in the criminal justice system, the defendant pled guilty to an assault that occurred, as is described by the judge, in the context of what he said was an intense matrimonial argument. The outcome in that case was an absolute discharge. Conversely, after she sued the defendant civilly, the judge in the civil case found him liable for battery and the associated consequences of that, and awarded her nearly $800,000 in damages. Our review of the case suggested that there were a number of potential gaps in the investigation that had occurred and in the connections with other various systems that should be in place to support the survivor as they navigate the various criminal justice, health, and community settings. And so there was a need to assess the current knowledge and practices that are used by the various sectors that are involved in supporting families that are experiencing intimate partner violence. So we decided to undertake this study initially in the Fraser Valley. And the initial study into this issue was designed and implemented by my 3 undergraduate research students at UFB who worked under my supervision. Again, Manmeet Gill, Michaela Grattan, and Kaya Nielsen. The interviews were primarily coordinated and conducted by Manmeet, along with our team of undergraduate research students. And so I'd just like to briefly pass along my sincere appreciation for the significant amount of work that Manmeet in particular has put into this study. She's joining us, as you can see here today, but she's doing so in the middle of the night from Hong Kong. And so I'll continue to present the results rather than forcing her to do so at 1 a.m. So this will be a summary of the interview findings from those that we have interviewed to date for this project. So in total, the research team spoke over Zoom with 17 service providers in the Fraser Valley who work with survivors of intimate partner violence in a variety of capacities, whether this be in the community, in the criminal justice setting, or in the healthcare system. The participants that we spoke with have worked with clients experiencing intimate partner violence. They have experience working in this field from a range of around 3 years to over 25 years, so very well versed in these topics. Excuse me, I'm just recovering from a cold here. 81% of the sample reported that they formally screen their clients in some sort of capacity, such as through an intimate partner violence or a trauma screening tool. However, a much smaller percentage of our sample, 31%, reported that they asked about potential head or brain injury. Encouragingly, this did include some of those that were working in non-healthcare settings, suggesting that there is some awareness amongst criminal justice and nonprofit or community sectors about the importance of assessing for the presence of head injuries. Now, generally speaking, the primary reason for asking about a head trauma was to assess whether urgent medical attention was required for the survivor of the violent incident. One of our participants stated that this was due to a prior experience of having a client who experienced traumatic brain injury related symptoms going on for several weeks after the initial event. And as a result of understanding that this was a consequence of a traumatic brain injury, they now implemented this in their practice going forward to determine whether medical attention is needed for the person that they are working with. In terms of how clients were asked about a head injury, there was no common formal way of doing this. One participant explained that it would come up in the conversation that they were happening to have with the victim. Another stated that they would ask more specific questions, such as whether the person had hit their head or had their head hit. A third explained that EHS would screen the survivor to see if head trauma had occurred, while a fourth said that this information would be gathered as part of gathering factual information from the survivor. Consistently, although there was no standard way of assessing for whether or not a head injury or trauma had been sustained, the participants did indicate that they assessed not only for recent experiences, but also for lifetime experiences with having experienced a head injury. Now, more commonly, the participants in our study indicated that they would screen for strangulation. So just over half reported that they routinely would ask about this when speaking to their clients, or they would look in the information that had been gathered by others to check whether there was a history of non-fatal strangulation. Generally, though, the main reason why this was done is because it was recognized by the participants that non-fatal strangulation is a substantial risk factor for lethality. However, only 2 of the participants who screened for strangulation mentioned doing so because there could be a potential medical concern needing attention. So in total, 5 of our participants screened, whether formally or informally, for both head injuries and strangulation. 3 of our participants screened for strangulation, but not for head injuries, and 7 did not screen for anything. Now, for some, this was because in their primary role working with a survivor of violence, they would receive information from other segments of the system who they relied upon to do the initial screening. But others worked with agencies that had never formally implemented any screening or had never thought about screening for these types of issues, although they certainly were interested in learning more about how they might be able to adapt their practices to do so going forward. Now, although our sample size was too small to run any statistical significance tests, which probably makes my undergraduate students pretty happy, given that I had to teach them all research methods in their undergraduate degree, there were some patterns of interest in the data. So for example, there appeared to be a trend, probably not a surprising one, where those of our participants who routinely screened for head injuries were generally confident in their ability to detect a traumatic brain injury, whereas those who didn't routinely screen for head injuries were not confident in their ability. So more specifically, 100% of the participants who routinely screened for head injuries reported that they were either very or somewhat confident in their ability to detect if their client had experienced a traumatic brain injury. Conversely, 40% of those who did not screen for head injuries felt either somewhat or very unconfident in detecting if their client had experienced a head injury, while another 40% said that they were neither confident or unconfident in their ability to detect this. Only 2 of those who did not routinely screen for head injuries said that they felt at least somewhat confident in detecting when a client may have experienced one. Overall, many of the service providers that we spoke to felt that they were unprepared to identify when a client had experienced a head trauma, such as a TBI, and that they were unfamiliar with what they can do to support them should it be disclosed that their client had in fact sustained a head injury. Most commonly, participants said that if they knew that their client had experienced either a head injury either recently or in the past, that they would recommend that they get medical attention. However, many of the participants also commented on the long wait times at the hospital, and so said that even if they went to the hospital in the first place, it was unlikely that their client would be willing to wait the length of time that it would be needed in order to actually speak to somebody there. And so they would often leave before seeing anybody, and many of their clients did not have a family doctor who they could follow up with. And so there was a gap there in terms of receiving the needed medical attention. Consequently, about half of our sample said that they believed survivors of intimate partner violence in the Fraser Valley either never or seldom sought medical care following a violent incident. And participants were generally not aware of any other resources where they could send their client for support. What they would like to see included medical professionals who can conduct a proper assessment. So not just a screen, but actually run through an assessment, and who could then follow up with the survivor to support them and provide them with the needed supports and services. Some participants mentioned that having a connection to the forensic nurses would be one way to receive this support, and that they had used this support in the past. But for those who live outside of Abbotsford and other areas of the Fraser Valley, getting their clients connected to a forensic nurse was difficult due to limited transportation options, or having clients who were unwilling or unable to travel due to lack of time, due to an inability to take time off of work, or because they had nowhere else to send their children in the meantime. And of course, there was also the fear of accessing services and having their abuser finding this out. Only a couple of participants identified brain injury clinics as being an available resource to them, but they were not sure what happened once a referral was made for their client, whether a follow-up had happened, or what services would be provided if they did in fact get connected with the brain injury clinic. They also weren't sure if anybody at the clinics would specialize in intimate partner violence related cases, and so be able to support the survivor from that perspective as well. Several of our participants spontaneously mentioned that they would like to see a patient navigator. So somebody who can be there to support the survivor as they work their way through not only the healthcare system, but also simultaneously the criminal justice system, and often the social service system as well. However, they commented that while there were potentially people who could fill this role, such as those who are working in victim services, for example, few people from outside the healthcare system were likely to have received any specialized training on traumatic brain injuries. Interestingly, about 57% of participants felt that head injuries were either moderately, very, or extremely common amongst survivors of intimate partner violence in general. So it was recognized that this is likely going to be a common phenomenon among people experiencing violence, violent victimization. However, when they were asked to consider the population of clients that they specifically worked with, the same percentage believed that head injuries were either not at all or only slightly common. So in other words, there appears to be a discrepancy between understanding that head injuries are a common outcome of intimate partner violence, and then recognizing that this occurs amongst their own clients. Now, we have no way to validate whether this is an accurate perception or reflection of the population that they may be working with, or if it may be due to the lack of prior training or education about screening for traumatic brain injuries amongst clients. But we also asked participants to rank how well they believed that head injuries amongst survivors of intimate partner violence were understood by service providers in general in the Fraser Valley, to which 60% responded that this issue was either not at all or only slightly understood. So we're inclined to believe that rather than the population not likely to be presenting with head injuries, it's more likely that simply these screening protocols have not been done to detect these issues. So not surprisingly then, when asked whether they or their agency more broadly would benefit from receiving further education or training regarding head injuries among survivors of IPV, every single one of our participants said yes. And in fact, I'm happy that some of them are here today joining us and receiving some of this education. More specifically, participants said that training on head injuries could help them to recognize when a behavior being exhibited by their client might be indicative of a head injury, and then what to do with that information, as few knew where they could send their client for support, beyond recommending that they go to the hospital and receive medical attention. They said that it would also help them to understand their clients better, to help them understand why they may be struggling and how to strategize accordingly to better support them. Participants expressed that having online training available and having protocols that would guide them what to ask, when to ask, how to ask it, and then what to do with that information would all be incredibly helpful. So this is not unlike the findings of previous research. For example, Nemeth et al. In 2019 conducted focus groups with 62 intimate partner violence service providers in Ohio and concluded that there was limited knowledge and training on brain injury and how that might impact the way that survivors accessed and experienced the various services. Like our findings, the service providers in that study, they recognized that brain injuries were more common than they'd previously thought, but they did not know how to identify it or what to do once a brain injury had been identified. And they were concerned about identifying it if the necessary services were not in place and available to connect the survivor to the supports that they needed. So this led Nemeth et al. To recommend that domestic violence organizations consider developing relationships with local brain injury experts to link survivors with brain injury recovery services in their broader community. They recommended that agencies serving clients involved in intimate partner violence seek training on brain injuries and begin to discuss this, to raise this issue on a more consistent basis with their client population. Likewise, Murray et al. In 2016 recommended that service providers learn the symptoms of traumatic brain injury and engage in screening practices using tools like the HELPS brain injury screening tool. While difficult to do, they also spoke about the importance of attempting at least to distinguish whether the observed or the reported symptoms are attributable to the TBI as potentially to other sources such as PTSD or depression. Integrating questions that then ask about prior exposure to head trauma can potentially begin to separate out whether these may be symptomatic of a TBI or of a larger issue such as PTSD. Other reasons for service providers to become more familiar with symptoms of traumatic brain injury are to avoid reflexively assuming that these behaviors reflect a lack of willingness to engage in the services, and considering how practices may be adapted to better meet the needs of the person with the brain injury, such as breaking up tasks into smaller intervals, rephrasing language to make it more simple, or being prepared to repeat information multiple times. As one example that they provided, survivors of violence have a difficult time following an abstract safety plan and may be better positioned to remember what to do if there's an app that they could use or a clear checklist if it's safe to take something like that home with them, if they're living on their own, for example. Like Nemeth et al., they also advise that providers should become familiar with and develop relationships between their agency and the local agencies serving providing traumatic brain injury services, such as brain injury clinics, in order to improve the number of clients that they are able to refer for services and rehabilitation. However, they also recommended that practitioners should be familiar with some of the barriers to receiving these kinds of services and address with the survivor why they may not be willing to seek out or accept an intervention for traumatic brain injury, something that our next presentation will address. And finally, Haag et al. In 2019 argued that we need to educate others about just how common TBIs are, especially amongst populations that are more vulnerable to experiencing the more severe forms of intimate partner violence, such as among Indigenous women, as we noted before. And that we need to educate service providers about what some of the unique barriers to service uptake may be amongst Indigenous peoples. To this end, she and her team have developed a TBI educational toolkit that integrates Indigenous views, worldviews, and perspectives. One of the critical findings from her study was that while we need to provide more structure and guidance to support service providers in knowing when and how to ask their clients about traumatic brain injury, it's also important that the resulting strategies remain flexible and respect each person's unique situation, such as the nature of the support that they have around them, with the family and with their broader community, while also taking into consideration things like systemic barriers to accessing services in healthcare and intergenerational experiences of trauma. So in the end, my presentation may have raised more questions for many of you than it was able to answer, but that's why I'm up first with a series of amazing presentations to follow me, where our presenters will take you through a number of suggested strategies that may be used by you in order to detect and support your clients who may have experienced an intimate partner violence-related traumatic brain injury. And so at this point, we'll draw my talk to a close to give you an opportunity with the remaining few minutes we have to ask any questions that may have come up during my presentation. So I'll just stop sharing my screen here and I'll ask Manmeet and Michaela to go through the chat room to see if anybody's posted a question, or if you'd like to take a minute now to post a question. We've got a few minutes left before we take a break before the next presentation begins at 11.